There's a certain segment of the AEW fan base that seems to be bothered whenever AEW does any sort of nod to pro wrestling history, whether that's in this case with Taz and the unnamed promotion, of course, of ECW, which they're not going to talk about on TV, or whether it's ROH, or whether it's Brian Danielson versus Nigel McGuinness from last year. Um, there's just this weird feeling that AEW, from certain segments of the AEW fan base, that stuff needs to be left behind, or AEW shouldn't focus any of their attention on that. And I saw some arguments today that it would have been a waste to use any of the TV time last night on Taz when you're trying to sell a pay-per-view and all of these sorts of things. And I don't know. I think sometimes we lose sight of what pro wrestling is. And yes, we all understand it's a business, and we all understand they're selling a pay-per-view. But had Taz been comfortable with it, it wouldn't have killed the pay-per-view, and it wouldn't have killed the business, and it wouldn't have hurt the show at all to carve out 90 seconds, or even, dare I say, 5 minutes to do a segment on the show honoring Taz in that building. It wouldn't have been that big a deal. Every second of every television show doesn't have to be devoted to trying to sell a pay-per-view. And, additionally, I think it's important that AEW sort of has to be the caretaker of the non WWE version of wrestling history. Because if it's not AEW, then who? Then who's going to do it? Right? If it's WWE has been presenting their version of wrestling history for how many years now? And then we see how oftentimes that becomes not only accepted truth, but the only acceptable version of history. And that means that something like ROH is going to eventually be completely bumped out of wrestling history, because WWE is never going to acknowledge ROH because they don't own it. And honestly, I think it's very important, and it's good, and it's very important that AEW does nod to the rest of the history of professional wrestling. And yes, they're always going to prioritize ROH because they own it. There's some self-servedness to that for sure. But Tony recognizes the greater landscape, the entire world of pro wrestling. And from that standpoint, I think it's important that we have AEW that will continue to recognize the history of ROH, or the history of ECW, or just the greater history of professional wrestling that WWE chooses to ignore. We need them to be a curator of that, because no one else is going to do it. WWE is not going to do it. Nobody else is in a position to do it. So I don't know. I just don't like these attitudes of, oh, AEW spends too much time focusing on ROH, or modern fans don't care about Brian Danielson, or, I don't personally remember the Brian Danielson Nigel McGuinness feud, so it's not something that they should, waste any time on, or, even though there's a whole other portion of the fan base that does remember that stuff and does remember it fondly. And why can't you serve everyone? Right? And more importantly, why can't we keep the flame of wrestling history alive? Because that's something I'm passionate about and that I think is important. Because wrestling doesn't have a documented history other than WWE's version of it, where something like ROH or something like Taz's legacy in that 2300 arena will largely be erased because they don't own ROH and Taz doesn't work there. And these are just two examples, but you get the idea. And I just think that there's sometimes a hint of irony in the mindset of certain corners of the AEW fan base, where they can't be bothered with any history that isn't part of AEW's history. And I just think there's irony in that, and they don't see that that's exactly how the other side behaves. That's exactly how the thing that they hate operates. That only their history matters, that only their version of history matters. And I think we have to be cognizant of that and careful of that. And I think that we're very lucky to have somebody like Tony Khan, who does care about wrestling history, And if AEW uses a couple of pay per view matches per year, or carves out 90 seconds of television time, or even 5 minutes of television time to keep the flame of wrestling history alive, that's not something we should complain about. That's not something where we should uh, bemoan the fact that they're not using that to sell a pay per view. That's something we should be celebrating because again, if not Tony, if not AEW, then who? If we're shouting down Tony Khan when he wants to do things like this, then the history of American wrestling is going to be WWE and Eric Bischoff's 83 weeks, WWE's version of WCW, which was essentially a 2 year period, 83 weeks in the NWO. Lucha Libre history is going to be AAA, meaning it didn't exist before 1993. Puro history isn't going to exist. ROH isn't going to exist. And that's not a history that I want. That's not a history I want passed down to the next generation of wrestling fans because the last generation of wrestling fans have already been poisoned by the one place that controls everything and only believes in one version of history. So that's why if you're an AEW fan who only wants to concern themselves with the Young Bucks or Swerve Strickland or the Hangman, that's fine. But I also think that AEW fans, of all people, should understand why it's important that AEW does want to keep history alive and does want to do nods to history. And when they decide to do things like Brian Danielson versus Nigel McGuinness, that even if you have no emotional connection to it, we can at least understand why it's important to do things like that and why it's important that wrestling history can't be left in the dust and only written by people who have no real care for it anyway. So, anyway, um, that's something I was thinking about as I saw people discussing whether or not Taz should have been honored on television um, had he been okay with it. And again, all a moot point because he wasn't interested anyway.